A little bit of film here. 2 points from yesterday's films. One, Tonkin Gulf. There is now absolutely no doubt that there was not an attack on August 4th, 1964. Whatever doubt lingered after all these years was removed entirely when the NSA released some messages intercepted from Hanoi, which seemed, if you read them one way, to be ordering an attack. They have been declassified, translated, deconstructed, and certainly unequivocally apply to August 2nd, not August 4th, when there was a small attack. Second, the Ia Drang battle that Barry talked about yesterday morning, I think, and that was shown there. Actually, there are two segments to that. All that was shown on the film yesterday and all that was shown in Mel Gibson's movie was the first, the heroic phase, X-ray, landing zone X-ray, when Hal Moore, who is just an incredible guy, if, God forbid, I had to go into combat on the ground, I would want to go behind him. I would follow him anywhere, I think. Hal Moore's unit performed spectacularly under tough circumstances. Shortly after that, another unit, poorly led and sort of straggling along from one landing zone to the other, fell into an ambush and was decimated. When Westmoreland was talking to the troops yesterday, as you saw, praising them for the victory, he was not fully aware of what had happened at Albany. And in fact, Albany was sort of covered up for many years. It's a tragic story. It's not mentioned in Mel Gibson's movie either. But it is the second stage of these operations in the Central Highlands. All right, just to start off right today, we've got a very serious and controversial issue, and I can tell from the mood of the crowd that you're ready for it. But we're going to start by trivializing it with short segments from two 1980s films that do a wonderful job of taking an issue that the nation is very upset about and bringing it down to about the bottom level. So, fire. All right. The operative words were the last words, obviously. This one is even worse. Get ready.
Is this Chuck Norris?
No. Rodney Dangerfield.
No.
I'm Professor Turkson. You know, a lot of people think history is just facts. It's just information about the past. But not me. I mean, I hold history very sacred. Sacred. The way the farmer looks at the earth and he holds it sacred. The way a Christian takes the Bible and he holds it sacred. The way a lot of people hold their marriage sacred. That's how I feel about it. So why don't we dive right in by interpreting one of the easiest events in the last 20 years of American history. Now, can someone tell me why in 1975 we pulled our troops out of Vietnam?
The failure of Vietnamization to win popular support caused an ongoing erosion of confidence in the various American but illegal Saigon regimes.
Is she right? Because I know that's the popular version of what went on there, and a lot of people like to believe that. I wish I could, but I was there. I was there in the classroom, hoping I was right, thinking about it. I was up to my knees in rice paddies with John Edwards going up against Charlie, slugging it out with him, while pussies like you were back here partying, putting headbands on, doing drugs, listening to the goddamn Beatle album.
Hey, Professor, take it easy, will you? I mean, these kids, they were in grade school at the time. And me, I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover.
Well, I didn't know you wanted to get involved with the discussion, Mr. Helper. But since you want to help, maybe you can help me, okay? You remember that thing we had about 30 years ago called the Korean conflict? Yeah, where we failed to achieve victory. How come we didn't cross the 38th parallel and push those rice eaters back to the Great Wall of China and take the Mercury Street and break and nuke them back into the fucking Stone Age River? How come, down the water? Say it! Say it!
All right, I'll say it. Because Truman was too much of a pussy wimp to let McCarthy go in there and blow out those coming bastards.
Good answer. Good answer.
Okay.
Like the way you think.
That's the way to introduce our topic of the morning. What's our time frame for?
We would like to go until 10 and have some discussion for about 15 minutes.
Till 10?
Yes, you get to 10.
All right. All right. All right. Why did we fail? Why did we fail? Why, despite our vast power and the magnitude of our 20-year commitment, were we unable to achieve the objective of an independent, non-communist Vietnam, to impose our will on what Lyndon Johnson once contemptuously dismissed as that raggedy-ass little fourth-rate country? Of all the questions that have arisen out of the Vietnam War, this is the one, or these are the one that I think have most nagged at us over the years, that have haunted us since that fateful time in April 1975 when the last helicopter departed the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, the first question, I think, is why is this so? Historically, as a nation, we have had an unmatched record of success. So much so that I think we have come to take success for granted. Failure comes hard to us and maybe harder than to other people because of this record. And to explain it, in the case of Vietnam, we have developed various rationalizations that have become part of the mythology we live by. We failed because we did not use our military power decisively, it is said, because the civilians put restrictions on the military that made it impossible to win. Sir, do we get to win this time, as Rambo just said? A ridiculous statement at face value, but one that is suffused with national mythology. Others insist that we didn't use our military power wisely. We attempted to fight World War II and Korea over in Vietnam instead of adapting to the war we found ourselves in and devising counterinsurgency tactics that would have been more appropriate and perhaps more workable. Still others claim that a treasonous anti-war movement and a hostile media turned the public against the war, thus subverting the national will. It has even been argued that television lost the war. And the sort of censorship that has been imposed since 1975 reflects some belief in these views. Now, I think one problem with all of these arguments is that they can never be more than speculation. Could we have won the war? Maybe, but no one can ever really be sure what would have happened if we had done things differently, if we had fought without restriction, if we had devised a counterinsurgency strategy, if we had suppressed the anti-war movement and censored the media. And to attribute our failure to flaws of strategy and a lack of will, at best, I think, oversimplifies a very complex problem and provides at best a partial explanation. Now, God forbid I am not up here to defend the strategy, if you can call it that Lyndon Johnson and his advisors developed in 64 and 65 to fight this war. In a sense, Rambo is right We never set out to win this war in the traditional sense. Winning was deemed unnecessary at the beginning in 64, 65. It was certainly deemed too costly and also potentially too risky, if by this you mean subduing North Vietnam so that you could impose your own solution over the entire country of Vietnam. The aim was more subtle, to use military power to control the behavior of another nation. Gradual escalation, it was called. And the theory, which is based on the writings of a number of academic theorists about strategy in the 60s, including most prominently Thomas Schelling, was that if you slowly increase the level of pain, you would reach that breaking point eventually where North Vietnam would have no choice but to cry uncle. You would reach a point where for the other side the costs were greater than the potential gain, and they would decide to go along with what you were doing. I'm going up old Ho Chi Minh's leg an inch at a time, was the way Lyndon Johnson in his inimitable fashion put it in a conversation with George McGovern in 1965. To add just sort of briefly, all of this theorizing about gradual escalation develops out of the dilemma first addressed directly in Cuba of how to fight in the nuclear age, of how to conduct a war at a time when all-out war raised the possibility of escalation to the nuclear level and possibly annihilation. It was used with some success in the missile crisis. In other words, we didn't start out with the most extreme measures in the missile crisis, but started at a low level, the so-called quarantine rather than a blockade, which is technically considered an act of war. And I think that experience in a lot of different ways shapes the way that Johnson and his advisors look at strategy in Vietnam. And of course, all of the different elements of this, rolling thunder, search and destroy, all of these elements reflect this notion of gradual escalation, using only the level of force that is absolutely necessary to achieve the limited aim you set for it, which is to maintain an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. There's often talk about not having a clear-cut goal in the war. Our goal was absolutely clear, to maintain an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. And of course, with rolling thunder, the sort of other things are to slow down or to interdict the North Vietnamese, the passage of North Vietnamese men and supplies in the South, raise the morale of the South, and to coerce North Vietnam into going along with our aims. And I don't think there's reason to go here in detail into all the reasons why it doesn't work. They're spelled out in considerable detail in the book, and I would just be repeating that here. Big problem, of course, is that North Vietnam is always able to replace its losses, and the bombing is never as effective as one might have liked, for a whole variety of reasons. Bombing in the mid-60s hasn't developed much beyond World War II. By 1971, 72, it has, but at this point, it's still relatively primitive by the standards we've seen in recent years. And of course, the North Vietnamese were creative, resilient, and absolutely determined in resisting this as everything else. Barry mentioned last night the Paul Dumé Bridge in Hanoi, which was bombed just about every year of the war and replaced and bombed again and replaced and bombed again and replaced. The air defense system was described by one airman as hell with Hanoi as its hub, not only including SAMs, but aircraft even rifles. If you flew low to avoid the SAMs, you would get rifle fire. Very tough. Search and destroy also pose its problems, as you saw yesterday. I don't think you need much. The film shown yesterday illustrated about as well as it could. What was it, Hill 943? The difficulties of ground warfare. The big problem, of course, was that finding the enemy in the first place, and the fact that if you ever got them under huge pressure, they could retreat into sanctuaries in North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which raises the possibility of why didn't we invade those areas, which raises all kinds of new possibilities. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. What particularly struck me in doing my research for my book on Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam, his conduct of the war, is that nobody, by 1966, nobody in the high councils of government was really satisfied with the way the war was going or the strategy was playing out. And yet never was there anything approaching a full-scale reassessment. You know, makes you wonder. And this doesn't happen under Johnson, never does. Anytime somebody pushes for a reassessment, whether it be Brute Krulak of the Marine Corps, whether it be General Harold Johnson, Chief of Staff of the Army, no matter who it may be, civilian advisors, McNamara at points, Johnson deflects it, resists it, finesses it, which he's wonderfully capable at doing. He's a magician of finesse. Never does it. Why? I really am not sure. I can't, it maybe was a matter of not wanting to admit that what he was doing was wrong, but it's a phenomenon that is quite striking when you look at this. A flawed strategy then clearly helps to explain our failure in Vietnam. But to jump from there to the conclusion that the unrestricted use of American power could have produced victory at acceptable cost seems to me to raise some very difficult questions. We can never know whether an unrestricted bombing campaign of the sort the Joint Chiefs advocated in 1965 and after would have forced Hanoi to settle on our terms, but there is reason to question, I think, that it would have. The American experience with strategic bombing in World War II and Korea suggests that it has very serious limitations. The capacity of air power to cripple a pre-industrial nation like North Vietnam may in fact have been quite limited. What was the good of bombing them into the Stone Age, as General LeMay proposed, when, as one sardonic wag put it, they were already there? Before the early 70s, the advent of the smart bomb, again, we didn't have, the capability was very limited. Now, there are always people who talk about Linebacker 1 in June of '72 and Linebacker 2, the so-called Christmas bombing, as exemplifying that the war could have been won with air power. Linebacker 1 did have a huge impact during the Easter offensive, but the main reason it did was by this time you were fighting a North Vietnamese army that was heavily dependent on POL, gasoline, petroleum, spare parts, and that sort of thing, which was much easier to interdict and manage. Invasions of the sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia, ground operations in North Vietnam might have made Westmoreland's strategy of search and destroy work better. But there are also risks here in terms of expanding the war into new areas when we were having a very difficult time managing the war in Vietnam. And of course, neither of these would have solved what was always the central problem in this war, and that is the political viability of South Vietnam. The reasons Johnson refused to escalate the war in these ways have been dismissed. But I think they need to be taken seriously. He refused to expand the war because of the risk, obviously, of Soviet and possibly Chinese intervention. In the very beginning, of course, it didn't seem necessary. You're never going to do you're never likely to do full measures when you think you can succeed with partial measures. And that's the way that's very much the mentality they started out in 1965. Secondly, he feared, almost to the point of an obsession, if you push North Vietnam to the brink of defeat, the Soviet Union and China might have intervened, broadening the conflict to dangerous, perhaps deadly proportions, even to the level of nuclear confrontation. And Rodney Dangerfield, to the contrary, the memories of Korea and the Chinese divisions rushing across the Yalu in the fall of 1950 were very, very vivid in the minds of Johnson and others. One of Johnson's nightmares, of course, as he used to tell it, was that he personalizes everything. It's a great fault. That an American pilot who would undoubtedly be from his hometown of Johnson City, Texas, right there, would drop a bomb down the smokestack of a Soviet freighter in Haiphong Harbor, and the next thing you knew, you would have World War III. Now, it's been fashionable in recent years to dismiss or play down Johnson's fears. Chinese, Russians would never intervene. Of course, we don't know. We can't be sure. They can have all the war plans they want. We don't know whether they're going to execute them or not. But evidence from Soviet and Chinese archives does suggest we know that their involvement in the war was much greater than we thought it was at the time. And it seems possible, if not indeed likely, that they might have intervened. A North Vietnamese diplomat told me in Hanoi in 1997 that they looked at the possibility of Chinese intervention the way we looked at nuclear weapons, as a deterrent that they would really rather not use for the obvious reasons pointed out in our discussions on yesterday, that having the Chinese, when the Chinese came, they tended to stay a long time, and this was not something that they were eager to have. They had 1,000 years, right? Finally, had the United States been able to militarily subdue North Vietnam without provoking outside intervention, what then? What's next? Well, it would have faced the dangerous and costly task of occupying a hostile nation along China's southern border while simultaneously suppressing an insurgency that presumably was still going on in South Vietnam. Would a counterinsurgency strategy have produced better results? Well, this is the conventional wisdom of today, the rage of today. The new gospel within the Army, at least, it always has been kind of in the Marine Corps, is counterinsurgency. This includes a book by Mark Moriar that Barry mentioned yesterday, another book by John Nagel, the new field manual, the new Army field manual, which was rewritten by General Petraeus, puts heavy stress on counterinsurgency. So much emphasis in the Army now on counterinsurgency that the conventional war people, the tank people and others, are fighting a rearguard action to kind of maintain their place in the Army. The Marine Combined Action Platoon Program was implemented in I Corps. It did enjoy some success, but it's difficult to see, for me to see, how it could have been employed on a countrywide basis simply from the lack of skilled personnel, and particularly given the sort of institutional bias in the military at this time against counterinsurgency. It was something that was very difficult to carry out. We didn't have the people who spoke the language, who knew the people, who could work with them closely. The South Vietnamese leadership, who we relied upon, themselves Western-oriented, in some ways out of touch with their own people, never showed much inclination or capacity to do it effectively. Now, it is clear that Abrams, General Abrams is he's a wonderful contrast to Westmoreland. Westmoreland is starched. Everything is just so. He's sort of a mail order general right out of the catalog. Abrams is rumpled and slovenly in many ways, chomping a cigar. He was He was a chronic insomniac. He put himself to sleep at night by sitting in a great big chair and drinking a whole bunch of scotch. U.S. Grant, or is he and he loved Wagner, so is he the model for Robert Duvall's character in Apocalypse? I have no idea, but he could well be. Abrams, after 68, for the first time really develops programs that integrate military operations and pacification. What had such a low priority in the mid-60s, it was called the Other War. Abrams is able to integrate these after 68 in ways that nobody else had. The problem is that by this time it's too late. Pacification might have worked if you had started in the mid-50s and really focused on it and had the right kind of people doing it. I'm willing to go that far with it. Otherwise, I'm not at all convinced. Now, I'm going to kind of take the coward's route here, I guess, since we're going to talk about the anti-war movement and the media and all of those things. I'm going to skip over those this morning, except to say, I'll do just enough to provoke some people, except to say that I do not believe. Did they have an impact? Yes, they had an impact, and I'll talk about the impact of the anti-war movement on Thursday. We'll talk about the impact of the media at some point. Was the media reporting good? Absolutely not. Some of it was excellent, some of it was terrible, a lot of it was in between. But in neither case do I find these things decisive. I am absolutely convinced by John Mueller's argument that public opinion in the wars we have fought since World War II is generally driven by casualty lists. And he documents this very effectively for Korea, whereas the media was positive. There was no anti-war movement for Vietnam and Iraq. They run almost perfectly in tandem. A surge of support for the war and then a gradual sort of decline as casualty lists increase. Okay, I think the problem with all of these explanations is that they are too ethnocentric. They reflect the persistence of what a British scholar has called the illusion of American omnipotence. The belief, almost a national article of faith, that the difficult we do tomorrow, the impossible may take a while. When failure occurs, therefore, it must be our fault, and we find scapegoats in our midst. The bad judgment of our leaders, media, anti-war movement, and so forth and so forth. The flaw in this, or one of the obvious flaws, is that it ignores the other side of the picture. In this case, the Vietnamese side, which is, we should concede, I think, a very important side. The question we most often ask, and that I ask at the beginning, then is the wrong question, or at least not the whole question. Instead of asking why we failed, we need to ask why the other side succeeded, or at least why the war came out as it did. And in looking at that, I would like to focus on a couple of 3 or 4 things. One, the circumstances of the war itself, which you got a pretty good, some of you know firsthand, in which you got some pretty good images of yesterday afternoon. The circumstances of the war itself, the nature of the conflict, the weakness of our allies, secondly, and the relative strength of our adversary. And you got some pretty good pictures of that yesterday morning with the images from Dien Bien Phu. This war posed extremely difficult challenges for Americans. It was fought on a climate and a terrain that were singularly inhospitable. Triple canopy jungles, foreboding swamps and paddies, rugged mountains, heat that could kill a man, bake his brains, or wring the sweat from him till he died of exhaustion, as one Marine put it. And it was as if the sun and the land itself were in league with the Viet Cong, this person added, wearing us down, driving us mad, killing us. Needless to say, those who had endured this land for centuries had a certain advantage, although it's important to note, and you got a good picture of this from a wonderful novel whose name I'll probably forget, but it's on the bibliography. His name I've completely forgotten, excuse me. I'll come back to it at the end. That depicts the problems that Northerners suffered when they came south, particularly with malaria, where they confronted Bao Ninh, the sorrows of war. A strain of malaria that they were by no means used to and could not get protection against, so they're not invulnerable. It was a people's war where people rather than territory were the primary objective, but Americans as individuals or as a nation, I think, could never really bridge the gap between themselves and all Vietnamese, not knowing the language or the culture. They didn't know, even in a lot of cases, how to tell friend from foe. What we need, one officer suggested half jokingly, half seriously, was some kind of litmus paper that turns red when it's near a communist. Maybe they've got things mixed up, one of novelist Tim O'Brien's bewildered GIs comments after a seemingly friendly farmer bows and smiles and points them right into a minefield. Maybe they cry when they're happy and smile when they're sad. Regarding recalling the emotionless response of a group of peasants, one Marine recalled that they did nothing and I hated them for it. Their apparent indifference made me feel indifference. The cultural gap produces cynicism and even hatred towards people we're trying to help. We're fighting, dying for a people who resent our being here, one GI wrote home. More important yet, the formless yet entirely lethal nature of warfare in Vietnam, a war without distinct battle lines or fixed objectives, where traditional concepts of victory and defeat become blurred. A formless war, one veteran wrote, against a formless enemy who evaporates into the morning jungle mist, only to pop up some other time, some other place, a type of warfare particularly difficult for we Americans to fight. And there's always the nagging question, I think probably first raised by JFK himself, how do we tell if we're winning? It's not taking territory. The body count is what they came up with, but that didn't, that was unsatisfactory in a whole variety of ways and corrupting in a whole variety of ways. More important, I think, in explaining our ultimate failure is the balance of forces we aligned ourselves with in Vietnam. In South Vietnam, we attempted a truly formidable undertaking on the basis of a very, very weak foundation. The country to which we committed ourselves in 1954-55 lacked many of the basic ingredients for nationhood. And I think had we looked all over the world, we might not have been able to find a less promising place for a nation-building project. The economy devastated by the Japanese occupation, the First Indochina War, far more than in the rest of Vietnam, the old order had been destroyed, but nothing had been created to replace it. There was a vacuum there. The government we inherited began as a French puppet government with the notorious Bao Dai experiment in 1949. It lacked at the beginning and was never able to establish real claim to legitimacy among the people it purported to govern. When viewed from this perspective, I think there may have been built-in limits to what we could have accomplished there. Nearly 20 years we struggled to establish a viable nation, did lots of good things. The film I thought yesterday did a good job of showing the positive things that Americans were doing in medical care and the rest. But the rapid collapse of South Vietnam 2 years after our withdrawal suggests how little ultimately was really accomplished. The other side of this coin is that from beginning to end, we drastically underestimated our enemy. The key in war is know your enemy, and we did not know our enemy at all. I was watching this film I showed on Dien Bien Phu yesterday, was watching it shortly after it came out in 1981, and a much decorated Marine was watching with us, and who had been in Saigon in April of '75, and he was awestruck in watching those images and said, "My God, no wonder this is what we were up against." I don't want to suggest here that there's some kind of super people, as there sometimes were portrayed in anti-war propaganda. They made colossal blunders. They paid an enormous price for their success. They demonstrated, as Barry pointed out, a far greater capacity for waging war than for building a nation. Still, in this war, they had distinct advantages. From the beginning of the revolution back to the 30s, as I suspect Barry will talk about later today, the communists, for a whole variety of crazy reasons, mostly the Ho Chi Minh connection, drew into their camp the best of the traditional Vietnamese ruling classes and the most able, dedicated political activists. They were thus blessed with superior leadership from Ho at the top down to the village level. They were skillful, indeed fanatical organizers. Their military operations were done on sandboxes down to the last detail, sometimes overly planned, but they were planned with enormous care and attention to detail. They tapped the well springs of Vietnamese nationalism and the urge for social reform to mobilize the people of the country into a total and concentrated effort to seize power. Sold out by the Chinese and the Soviets at Geneva in 1954, as I pointed out yesterday, they ably exploited the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s to advance their own ends without at any point becoming dependent on their allies. They improvised through trial and error a strategy. I guess this strategy, maybe great powers in fighting lesser powers don't feel like they have to strategize because they're stronger, whereas the lesser power, particularly one fighting for its very survival, as North Vietnam saw itself, and certainly as the NLF saw itself, have to think in strategic terms. And they developed a unified, integrated strategy which brought together politics, military, diplomacy, the whole basket fairly effectively. Protracted war was, the key, the secret. It had worked against France. They presumed it would work against the United States. "You will kill 10 of our men, we'll kill 1 of yours," Ho remarked to a French officer in 1946, "and in the end it is you who will tire." And this obviously is the same sort of reasoning that went on. They also particularly the southern NLF forces, had the advantage of that the guerrilla enjoys in warfare. As long as you don't lose, you win, right? As long as you don't lose, you win. So all you have to do is avoid defeat. And what they do in the 60s particularly is to melt away into the countryside or across the Cambodian border or across the 17th parallel or wherever. The fatal error then is to underestimate the adversary. We rather casually assume that the Vietnamese, rational human beings like ourselves, would know better than to stand up against the most powerful nation in the world. It would be all of Johnson's points of reference are Congress. That was the experience that shaped him so much as a man. It would be like a filibuster in Congress, Johnson predicted. Enormous resistance at first, then a steady whittling away, then old Ho hurrying to get it over with. How little we knew at that time, this would have been 65, 66, was that Ho Chi Minh was not then and had not been for 2 years the driving force in the North Vietnamese government. He was a powerful figurehead until his death on September 2nd, 1949, the anniversary of the day he was in Ba Dien Square. He was a figurehead of enormous importance, but he was not the driving force. Lê Duan and Trung Chinh were the people who were really making the decisions. Henry Kissinger still later confessed great surprise with the discovery that his North Vietnamese counterparts, in his words, were fanatics. Since our goals were limited and from our standpoint reasonable, we never sought to destroy or to defeat North Vietnam. We found it hard to understand, to come to grips with their total unyielding commitment. I go back to the great Chinese philosopher of war, Sun Tzu. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. In this case, I think clearly we did not know the enemy. In some ways, I think we did not maybe know ourselves real well. The circumstances of the war then pose a dilemma I think we never really understood, much less resolved. Success might have required the annihilation, the physical annihilation of North Vietnam, but given our limited goals, this would have been distasteful and excessively costly. It held out the threat of Soviet and Chinese intervention. The only other way is to establish a viable South Vietnam that is able on its own at some point to resist pressure from the North. But given the weak foundation we work from, not to mention the strength of the internal revolution, this may have been well beyond our means. To put it charitably, we may, and I want to emphasize may. We can't know, answers. Much as we would like history to be able to tell us what would happen if we'd done something differently, we really can't know. We don't know. To put it charitably, we may well have put ourselves in a classic no-win situation. What can or should we learn from all of this? And I would add quickly that even before, there was the first book that I know of called The Lessons of Vietnam was published in 1968, 5 years before the war was over. That tells you something about how we're thinking about this and how early we're thinking about it. Almost literally from the fall of Saigon and before, we have sought to learn lessons from our longest and in many ways most traumatic war. Critics from the left, of course, have insisted that the main lesson to be learned is to avoid interventions in third world situations that even remotely resemble Vietnam. From the right, the primary lesson has been that if we do intervene, we must do so with sufficient force to achieve a quick and decisive victory. This is what the Powell Doctrine is all about, which you may have heard about, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on Friday. I find most of these kinds of lessons of, at best, dubious value. History doesn't repeat itself. Each situation is unique. To extract lessons from one and apply them sort of mechanistically to another is at best misleading. The only true lesson of Vietnam, historian and former policymaker James Thompson reminds us with a great deal of hyperbole, but also with some insight, follow me closely, is never again take on the job of trying to defeat a nationalist anti-colonial movement under indigenous communist control in former French Indochina. A lesson he quickly added of somewhat less than universal relevance. To stop there would leave me open to far more questions, which I would probably want to avoid here, but would also be far too negative. You don't want to end on a negative note. I think there is a great deal of instruction and enlightenment to be found in history, even if I'm dubious of so-called lessons. And the first thing of two that I would really stress is the centrality of local circumstances in shaping the contours of and dictating solutions of international crisis situations. The point of this talk really has been that we have tended to focus in situations on what we did wrong, why we failed. You can go back to 1949 when all of this sort of begins, why we lost China, and carry it on through up to the present in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that what we do or don't do isn't important, but what I'm saying is that we've got to look beyond that to understand how situations take shape and how such situations play themselves out. By intervening in what was essentially a local struggle among Vietnamese, we placed ourselves at the mercy of local forces. The weak client that I've talked about, a determined adversary. These forces are always going to vary, but the point should be clear: we ignore them at our own peril. And I think, again, in fall of 2002, spring of 2003, whatever else we may have done right or wrong, we ignored the local force we were plunging ourselves into. There were some rather simplistic notions, many of them fed to top Bush administration figures by Iraqi exiles like Ahmad Chalabi, who was a world-class con man, that they were only too happy to believe, and that victimizes. A second point is the limits of power. It has been fashionable again to blame ourselves for fighting the wrong way, etc., etc. What I have tried to suggest here is that the situation posed grave challenges for us, may indeed have been beyond our control. This is not a point of view that is popular, I understand, among a people, a nation accustomed to having its way. But it's a view, I think, that we must consider, and even more urgently must consider now in the world we face today, where we no longer are the great power as we were in 1949 at the summit, as Churchill described it, or indeed as we were in the 90s and up to 2001, when we enjoyed what Charles Krauthammer called that unipolar moment, the United States as being the only great nation in the world. As great as our power is, there are still limits to what we can do, most of them set, again, by the intractability of internal situations in other countries. A third and final point is the value of history. What is so striking now, looking back on the early years of our involvement in Vietnam, is our abysmal ignorance of that country and its people and its history. To cite a small but revealing example, some years ago I ran across a document in which a U.S. official in the 1950s casually observed how difficult it would be to build an army in a country, they're talking about South Vietnam then, without any military tradition. a person obviously grandly ignorant of Vietnam's 1,000-year struggle against the Chinese, the Mongols, of their defeat of Kublai Khan, the Trung sisters, other legendary heroes who centuries before Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Wen Giap pioneered the art of guerrilla warfare. As I suggested yesterday, out of cultural arrogance as much as anything else, we also ignored the French experience in Vietnam. Such experience appeared irrelevant because we felt the French had pursued selfless colonial goals where we were pursuing different kind of goals, or because, as Edward Lansdale, the CIA guy out there in the mid-50s once put it, the French went from glorious defeat to glorious defeat while being highly articulate on how to win a war. They hadn't won a battle since Napoleon. They couldn't build the Panama Canal either. Closer examination of the French War, on the other hand, might have given us a really good education in terms of what we were going to be up against, alerted us to the challenges we would face in dealing with them. If nothing else, then, we might conclude that rather than employing usually false and misleading analogies, decision makers and the interested public might do better to use history to enlighten themselves about areas and peoples with whom they must deal. Particularly important when we're dealing with people who are very different culturally and historically from us. History, I think, like no other discipline, can give us a sort of perspective without which understanding is impossible. The other thing, obviously, is that history can tell us how we got to where we are, and sometimes when we see how we got to where we are, we see very quickly that the situation is not like we thought it was, or not like perhaps it's being presented to us. The true use of history, Sir Michael Howard has written, and I like to conclude on this note with 3 minutes left, I might add. The true use of history is not to make us clever for the next time, but to make us wise forever. Thank you very much.